And that was the iconic theme to the TV series Maverick, starring James Garner. And our guest today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop is author, TV historian Ed Robertson. I'm calling him the world's foremost authority on the TV series Maverick. He's the author of the book Maverick, Legend of the West. And Ed, would I be correct in saying that Brett Maverick was the first Western anti-hero?
Yes, you would. He was not only the first Western anti-hero. In many respects, he was the first anti-hero, period, in that he behaved in a way that you wouldn't expect a typical hero to behave in the 1950s, especially on a Western, which was the predominant genre of television. The typical Western hero, if confronted with, by a damsel in distress, will you help me? A Black Bart is burning down my house, and
right.
Everything's going to hell in the handbasket. The typical hero would, on television, would not hesitate to help the damsel in distress without thinking about what it might do to him. Well, along comes Brett Maverick, and if that same damsel comes up to him, he would say, well, what's in it for me? However, when push came to shove, he would do the right thing. He would face the villain down in the town square, and he would help the damsel in distress. Even in helping the damsel in distress, he would still keep an eye on the bottom line if there was $1,000, coming to him. But because it was a Western done with humor, 9 times out of 10 he'd lose out on the $1,000. So he would end up doing the right thing for nothing anyway.
That's, I think, the key to the show, what you said right there, a Western with humor. This is a revolutionary television show. I don't think people, certainly younger viewers who may be coming to it from the first time, and maybe they've seen the ripple effect of Maverick in other Westerns, certainly. But how was it perceived at the time? Was it thought of as revolutionary when it first aired?
Yes, it was, because it took all the trappings, it took all the cliches and turned them inside out. As the show continued to succeed and establish itself as a hit, there were several occasions where the show began to flex its muscles and challenge conventions even more. Like in one episode that Marion Hargrove wrote, called "The Rivals," which was an early episode featuring Roger Moore, who later replaced Jim Garner as Maverick. That was it was a Western in name only, in that it took place in the late 19th century, and everyone dressed like dude gamblers and stuff, but there was no gunplay,
right?
And there are no horses. I mean, those are like Rule 1 and Rule 2 in Westerns. I mean, it's got to have gunplay and horses, but there are times when Maverick wouldn't do that.
Now, you alluded to James Garner leaving the show, and I know you cover this extensively in your book, but can you give us the nutshell version of why Garner left?
Basically, there was a Writers Guild strike in the spring of 1960 that shut down production in television, and particularly Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers, at that point, they had close to 10 shows in production at the time. They were producing like 8 hours of television for ABC, and without scripts, Ghosty, it's hard to produce. It's hard to produce any shows. Now, when word of this came down to Jim Garner, I mean, he said, "Well, I still want to be paid because my contract calls, and I show up there. I'm supposed to be paid." And Warner Brothers did some maneuvering by saying, "Well, this is what you call, this is as close to an act of God in the television industry as you can come." That's what they call it. There's a clause called force majeure, which is essentially an act of God, unforeseen circumstances, and so therefore we don't have to pay you. Well, Jim had already been kind of grousing about the fact that his salary had been set as a contract player. I mean, Maverick was this big hit, and the studio was taking advantage of the show's popularity by sending him on promotional tours and to open up supermarkets and this, that, and the other thing, all on his free time, for which he was not getting any additional pay. Well, in the meantime, the studio was making a lot of money. Well, so Jim was already kind of grousing about that. And then, when the strike comes along and they pull this force majeure thing, he said, okay, well, you just breached my contract.
Well, the real reason I came by was to tell you, now that I'm free to, that I believe you. And in a way, I feel responsible. Your money was misappropriated while I was still with the bank.
Well, thanks, but Mr. Bates owes me the $15,000.
Mr. Bates isn't only dishonest, he's tough, shrewd, and intelligent. Do you really think you're going to get that money back from him?
Well, as I've been saying all week, I'm working on it.
What they're doing, Ghosty, is they're taking advantage of the fact that they had producers who were also writers, and so they couldn't work as writers, but they could work as producers, and basically they dusted off old scripts and changed names, and therefore they were able to stay in production, which pretty much blew their argument to Jim Garner.
Right.
And Jim had a lawyer who was smart enough to prove that, and he won. He won freedom from his contract, and he had the right to pursue movies and make his own deal, and that's what he did. And one thing about Jim that has served him well for going on 6 decades as an entertainment figure is that he is a man of principle, and he is not afraid to stand up for those principles on occasion if he believes that he has truly been wronged. And that's what he did with Warner Brothers in 1960, and that's what he did 25 years later when he took on Universal over a profit participation lawsuit with regard to the Rockford Files. So you have to have certain circumstances working for you, and you have to have a good set of lawyers behind you. It is not a cheap
Right.
proposition to take on a major studio. Jim has joked many times that in the case of Maverick, he made a total of $90,000 when he was filming Maverick as an actor.
Mm-hmm.
It cost him $100,000 to beat Warner Brothers. So So technically, he lost money on Maverick.
Now, let me ask you, what prompted you to write this book, which I should tell the listeners you actually wrote several years ago, and it's just coming out as a revised edition, came out this year. What prompted you to sit down and write it? Was it a case of there's not a book like this? I'd like to read one as a fan of the show?
Kind of, more or less. I mean, the book Maverick: Legend of the West was originally released in the spring of 1994. I had just finished writing a book on The Fugitive, which was released in the summer of 1993, and that book was released around the time of the release of The Fugitive motion picture, which did very, very well at the box office and
Right.
generated a lot of interest in David Janssen and The Fugitive. Well, about a year later, Warner Brothers was in production to do a movie version of Maverick starring Mel Gibson and Jodie Foster and, as it happened, James Garner. And so the idea was the publisher and I decided to work on a book and so that it would be out in time for the film and hopefully do some cross-promotion there. And I had an opportunity to talk to pretty much all the major players involved with Maverick, including Roy Huggins, who created the show,
Sure.
Marion Hargrove, who wrote some of the best episodes, Leslie Martinson, who directed many of the best episodes, and a lot of people behind the scenes. Now, let's fast forward about 15 years to the early 2010s. I've since had a chance to talk to James Garner,
Mm-hmm.
and I've since had a chance. I mean, in that time, Maverick continues to play on cable.
Right.
The first season of Maverick was released on DVD, and so there's a resurgence of interest, and it seemed the time was right to revisit the book and update it and add some additional interviews and additional information and correct the occasional mistake, typographical errors that, you try to catch everything,
right.
Ghosty, but sometimes the ice plays tricks on you. So that the time seemed right to do that, and it features about 100 pages of new information that was not available in the first edition in 1994, because a lot of things can happen in 15 years, and in addition to new comments from James Garner, the Maverick Legend of the West second edition, which, by the way, you can find at MaverickLegendOfTheWest.com, features interviews with such iconic actors as Sherry Jackson, as well as a very lengthy interview with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., whose first major television role was as Dandy Jim Buckley on Maverick. So
right.
That's just a sample of the new information available in the second edition of Maverick, Legend of the West.
Before I let you go, I do want to mention your radio show, TV Confidential, which, how long has that been on the air?
We just entered our 5th year on TV Confidential, radio talk show about television, heard every week at various times. Go to our website, tvconfidential.net, to find out where and when and how, and you can listen to the show. Plus, all of our shows are archived, so if you're not able to listen in real time, you can get caught up that way. But it's a radio talk show about television that not only features guests from some of our favorite shows in the past, but also gives our listeners a chance to sound off on some of the things that are going on today in television, not just network television, but cable television, daytime television, reality television, and any type of programming that you watch or is viable. I mean, we talk about it. So it's we look at both what's going on today as well as take a look at the past and have a chance to introduce you to some of our, some of your favorite personalities of the past, such as Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. or George Maharis. We got Charles Grodin coming up in a couple of weeks. We have Julie Adams coming up in a couple of weeks, and so it's a show that if you love television, old and new, you want to check it out to get and we be part of our conversation.
All right, well, Ed, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Ghosty.